Every comedy empire has a public face and a private wound. Mrs. Brown's Boys gave the world a loud, chaotic Irish family that couldn't stop laughing. And for a long stretch of the 2010s, that was more than enough to make it one of British television's most obsessively watched programs. What it never showed was what happened when the cameras went dark, when the studio fell quiet and the applause dissolved into an empty car park. Brendan O'Carroll built one of the BBC's most-watched sitcoms on the loyalty of people who trusted him completely, some of them his own blood. And one by one, year after year, those people quietly left. Not with explosive public confrontations or career-ending feuds, but with packed bags and goodbyes that left fans scanning the credits for faces that were simply no longer there. This is the story behind those departures, told through the people who actually lived through them. Brendan O'Carroll didn't develop Mrs. Brown's Boys as a carefully pitched television concept. He created Agnes Brown to survive. Growing up in Dublin inside a large working-class Irish family, O'Carroll absorbed the rhythms of women who talked fast, loved with intensity, and refused to be diminished by anyone. The character he eventually built around himself drew from all of them, a foul-mouthed, tender-hearted Dublin matriarch who could reduce a room to silence and then laughter inside the same breath. Agnes first appeared in a stage play in the early 1990s, a touring production that scratched together audiences in community halls and provincial theaters across Ireland, on a budget that left almost no room for error. Then, during one particular live show, the actress cast to play Agnes simply didn't arrive. O'Carroll grabbed a wig and a dress, walked out onto that stage, and the character he would spend the rest of his career performing was genuinely born in that one unplanned moment. The stage production spread through Ireland and the United Kingdom on word of mouth and raw energy alone. O'Carroll performed alongside his own family, his children Danny and Fiona in the roles of Dermot and Maria, his sister Eilish as Winnie McGugan, and his wife Jennifer Gibney eventually stepping into the role of Kathy Brown. The whole operation ran on loyalty and shared history rather than formal arrangements, which gave it a warmth that professional casts can spend years trying to manufacture and rarely achieve. When the BBC brought the sitcom to television screens in 2011, that family chemistry translated into something viewers hadn't encountered in years, a comedy that felt genuinely and chaotically alive. Bloopers stayed in the final edit. The fourth wall came down whenever the cast felt like it. The performers laughed at themselves without embarrassment or apology. Critics reached for the word crude, while audiences reached for their remote controls to turn the volume up. And the show became synonymous with Christmas viewing across Britain and Ireland, in a way that very few television programs ever manage. What nobody examined too closely, at least not in public, was the weight accumulating underneath that success. O'Carroll wasn't simply the star performing the title role in a wig and a housecoat. He served simultaneously as the writer, the producer, the creative controller, and the patriarch of a literal family enterprise. The closeness that gave the sitcom its human warmth also made it nearly impossible to separate professional decisions from personal ones. When things began breaking down, they broke down across every dimension at once, on stage, off stage, in dressing rooms, and around actual family dinner tables. The first person to feel that pressure sharply enough to walk away was someone who had been part of O'Carroll's world almost from the very beginning. Rory Cowan had been in O'Carroll's orbit for over 2.5 decades before he quietly packed his belongings into a small carrier bag and walked away from the O2 Arena in 2017, after a sold-out show that the audience experienced as a complete triumph. His route into the Mrs. Brown's Boys universe hadn't come through drama school or formal auditions. He'd built his career in the music industry at EMI Records before losing that position and eventually finding his way to O'Carroll as a publicist. When an actor dropped out of a stage tour without any notice, O'Carroll asked Rory to fill in. 26 years later, he was still there, still playing the bleach-blonde, sharp-tongued Rory Brown, still delivering the one-liners that sent arena audiences into fits of laughter. His performance had an ease that looked effortless because it had been constructed across thousands of live shows, built from genuine affection for material he'd been inhabiting for decades. Fans didn't just enjoy what Cowan brought to the character. They had come to rely on it as something permanent. For the 18 months leading up to that quiet exit, Cowan had stopped feeling any connection to it. The touring schedule across United Kingdom arena venues was relentless. the constant travel exhausting. And while he stood on stage night after night projecting happiness to thousands, his mother's health was failing, and he couldn't be beside her as often as he needed to be. The gap between what the performance required and what his actual life demanded grew until he couldn't sustain it anymore. He finished the O2 show, said nothing dramatic, and was gone. O'Carroll's public response was warm and generous. He compared losing Cowan to Ronaldo departing from Manchester United's football club, and called him a driving force behind everything the show had accomplished. Cowan described it more simply. He had needed peace, and walking away was the only available route to it. His exit produced the first visible fracture in the show's carefully maintained image of a unified, unbreakable family. And fractures, once they appear in something built on trust, tend to find ways of spreading outward. Gary Hollywood's departure spread that fracture into full public view in 2020. And this time, no amount of carefully worded statements from anyone involved could soften what had clearly taken place behind the scenes. Hollywood had spent nearly 2 decades playing Dino Doyle, the sharp-tongued, stylish hairdresser who formed one of British television's most warmly received same-sex partnerships alongside Rory Brown. What Dino and Rory had given mainstream comedy was genuinely rare. A gay relationship built on humor and recognizable human warmth, rather than stereotype or easy punchline. Hollywood had helped construct that dynamic from the earliest days of Irish theater touring, all the way through to BBC Christmas special territory, and he brought genuine audience investment into every performance he gave. When Hollywood and Damen McKiernan, who had taken over the Rory Brown role after Cowan's departure, discovered they were being paid significantly less than other long-serving cast members for the 2020 Christmas specials, Hollywood raised the issue directly. According to reporting published by the Irish Post and the Daily Star, the response wasn't a negotiation. Hollywood was informed that his appearances in that year's Christmas specials would be reduced to a single episode. For someone who had dedicated 2 decades to building the show's most beloved character pairing, that response communicated something unambiguous about how his loyalty was being valued. He quit immediately. McKiernan was written out around the same period. Both the 2020 Christmas and New Year specials aired without either character, and audiences noticed their absence even without any explanation being offered from the production side. Reports of legal proceedings followed, with Hollywood reportedly pursuing claims of unfair dismissal and pay discrimination. O'Carroll denied wrongdoing publicly and described the situation as a misunderstanding. That framing didn't hold together particularly well against the visible reality that 2 experienced cast members had both raised pay concerns and both disappeared within weeks of each other. The show had always marketed itself as a genuine family operation, rather than a conventional entertainment industry production, and that image couldn't survive the story now circulating in public. Hollywood walked away after 2 decades feeling disrespected, and viewers who had followed the unfolding story found it considerably harder to watch the Brown family kitchen scenes without registering the absence of the people who were no longer standing in them. Fiona O'Carroll's departure in 2022 landed differently, because this wound was entirely internal, and no single decision or dispute could be assigned clear responsibility for it. She wasn't a comedian who had drifted into the family's professional orbit through connections or circumstance. She was the actual family, Brendan's daughter, someone who had absorbed the rhythms of Agnes Brown's fictional world since childhood, who had performed in cold provincial venues across Ireland long before any BBC production team showed up with cameras and budgets, and who had spent her entire adult professional life playing Maria Brown. The character had always served as the still point at the center of the sitcom's chaos. Quieter than the others, more grounded, the presence that audiences could recognize as someone they might actually know in their own lives. Fiona brought that quality because she had earned it across 30 years of real experience with the material, not performance training. What she couldn't sustain indefinitely was the emotional contradiction running through the center of her working life. Her marriage to Martin Delaney, who played her on-screen husband Dermot, had ended in divorce. Yet every filming schedule and every live performance continued to place them side by side as a couple deeply in love, required them both to rebuild in front of audiences, something that no longer existed between them in private. Fiona described her decision with a directness that made it seem almost inevitable in hindsight. She had been inhabiting someone else's story for so long that she had lost sight of what her own might look like, and she needed to step back from the production to find out. O'Carroll responded with genuine warmth, saying publicly that she was his daughter before she was Maria Brown, and that he respected her decision completely. That warmth was real and evident. But Maria had been the emotional anchor the whole show organized itself around, and without her, the comedy felt noticeably louder and considerably less settled in itself. Martin Delaney's exit followed a trajectory shaped by that same divorce, and by years of maintaining professional composure, while the personal structure around him had already come apart. As Dermot Brown, Delaney had delivered some of the show's most reliably funny material, a perpetually scheming, perpetually failing son who stumbled through every situation with a cheerful incompetence that audiences found genuinely endearing across multiple decades. His instincts for physical comedy were sharp, and his timing was natural, but by the early 2020s, every performance required him to stand alongside his former wife and sustain a marriage that existed only in the script. People close to him describe someone growing progressively quieter in the spaces between scenes, absorbing a cost that didn't register on screen, but was visible to everyone working around it. The professionalism held right to the end. The on-screen warmth remained convincing throughout, but the energy required to maintain that performance every night had become something he could no longer reasonably ask of himself. When he stepped back, there were no announcements, no explanatory interviews, and no dramatic departures captured by tabloids. His appearances reduced and then stopped, which was itself a kind of clear communication. Losing Martin meant losing one of the show's original pillars, someone whose presence had shaped Dermot Brown from the earliest touring stage productions through to BBC television audiences in the millions. Damen McKiernan's story carries a specific kind of unfairness that sets it apart from every other departure on this list. When Rory Cowan left in 2017, McKiernan stepped into the role of Rory Brown, fully aware of how unwelcome that substitution would be with a significant portion of the fan base. A former Mr. Ireland with limited acting experience, he inherited a character carrying 26 years of audience attachment and the unmistakable imprint of Cowan's comedic personality. Every line he delivered got measured against a performance people had been watching since the 1990s, and no interpretation he offered was ever going to satisfy everyone. McKiernan handled that sustained pressure with real composure. He developed a quieter, more grounded reading of the character, stopped trying to replicate what Cowan had done, and over time built something that audiences gradually came to accept on its own terms, separate from what had come before. That's what makes what happened in 2020 particularly difficult to excuse. Caught in the same pay dispute that ended Gary Hollywood's time on the show, McKiernan was written out of the Christmas specials without ceremony, public acknowledgement, or any apparent conversation about alternatives. He had stepped forward for a thankless position that most performers would have declined, absorbed years of unfair comparison to a predecessor with 26 years of audience goodwill behind him, and brought genuine consistency to a role that could have destabilized the show entirely. The response to all of that was a quiet removal. He never publicly criticized anyone involved in the decision, never gave interviews designed to expose the situation or settle scores. His name simply vanished from the cast listings, leaving fans with questions that the production showed little interest in addressing transparently. His exit completed the pattern that had been building since 2017. Performers leaving Mrs. Brown's Boys, not because they had stopped believing in what the show could be, but because the environment around it had stopped making room for them. Mrs. Brown's Boys continues to broadcast. Christmas specials still arrive each year. Agnes Brown still swears and stumbles and generates laughter across British and Irish television, and audiences still tune in with genuine affection for what the show represents. But the cast gathered around that kitchen table now bears almost no resemblance to the group that carried the production from Irish touring stages into a BBC institution people organized their holiday viewing around. Rory Cowan left searching for silence after decades of performing happiness he no longer felt. Gary Hollywood left when fairness was denied to him after 2 decades of loyalty. Fiona O'Carroll left to reclaim a story that had stopped being her own. Martin Delaney left because staying had become emotionally unsustainable. Damen McKiernan left because the production he had committed himself to stopped finding room for what he contributed. 5 different people, 5 different sets of circumstances, and one consistent truth running beneath all of them. At some point, the laughter stopped being worth what it cost to keep producing it. What remains is a sitcom that once felt like the most genuinely alive thing on television, now carrying the quiet weight of everyone it couldn't hold on to.